Karoline Leavitt kicked off Michelle Obama. Shocking moment. Michelle just crossed the line. You're nothing but a loudmouth mouthpiece. Karoline Michelle snapped, her voice cutting through the studio like a blade. The air in the Fox News studio froze, a sudden heavy silence falling over the room. Even the camera operators hesitated, fingers hovering over their controls. The crowd, which had been murmuring and rustling moments before, stilled, eyes fixed on the two women facing off under the harsh studio lights. The set of America Tonight, Fox News' flagship primetime political show, was packed. The audience, a mix of red and blue, leaned forward in their seats, eyes flicking between the two women seated opposite each other on the sleek glass table. To Michelle Obama's left, the bright, polished network logo gleamed under the spotlight. To Karoline Leavitt's right, a massive American flag rippled on the high-definition LED backdrop. The host, Anderson Myers, a tall, composed figure known for his calm yet probing style, shifted in his seat. He had seen fierce debates before, but the tension in the studio now felt different, heavier, like a summer storm about to break. "Ladies, let's keep this civil," Anderson said, attempting to rein in the spiraling confrontation. His eyes darted between Michelle's tight, controlled expression and Karoline's fiery stare. He knew this wasn't going to be an easy segment. "Civil," Karoline shot back, leaning in her blonde hair, catching the studio lights as she squared her shoulders. "I'm here to talk facts, Anderson. I'm not the one spouting baseless accusations." Michelle's jaw tightened, her polished, composed exterior flickering for a moment. She leaned back, crossing her arms with the grace of someone who had faced countless cameras and critics, but her eyes were sharp, calculating. "Facts," Michelle said, her voice low, a hint of steel slipping through her controlled tone. "You mean the kind of facts your boss fabricates? The kind of facts that twist truth into something unrecognizable?" The crowd murmured a few gasps and whispers, breaking the tension like cracks in glass. Karoline's eyes narrowed, her polished, media-trained smile slipping into something harder, more raw. "You want to talk about twisting truth?" Karoline shot back, her hands gripping the edges of the polished table. "Fine. Let's talk about your husband's legacy. Let's talk about the border crisis he ignored, the jobs lost, the American families forgotten. You want to stand there and preach to me about integrity? Spare me." Michelle's eyes flicked to the audience, catching the gaze of a few nodding heads. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a measured, deliberate tone, the kind she had used on countless campaign stages. "You mean the border crisis your boss made worse with his cruelty, separating families, tearing children from their parents?" She shot back, her words slicing through the air. "That's not strength, that's chaos." The studio crackled with tension. The camera swung between them, capturing every twitch, every tightened jaw, every clenched fist. Anderson Myers leaned forward, his fingers nervously tracing the edge of his cue cards. "All right, let's focus here," Anderson cut in, trying to steer the discussion back to safer ground. "We're here to discuss policy, not personal attacks." "Personal attacks." Karoline's voice cut through his like a blade. She leaned in, her eyes fixed on Michelle. "Tell me, Michelle, where was this outrage when your husband's policies crippled American industries, when middle-class families struggled to put food on their tables while you vacationed in Martha's Vineyard?" Michelle's composure slipped just a fraction. Her eyes darkened, her chin lifted, and her fingers tightened around the armrest of her chair. "We built this country back from the brink," Michelle said, her voice gaining momentum, each word sharper than the last. "We brought this economy back from the worst recession since the Great Depression, while your side cheered as corporations gutted American jobs." Karoline's smile returned sharp and defiant. "You brought back the economy. The only thing your administration brought back was debt and division. Don't lecture me about recovery when your policies left millions behind." The crowd rumbled again, a mix of cheers and boos echoing through the studio. Anderson raised a hand, his face a tight mask of professional composure, but the thin sheen of sweat on his brow betrayed his unease. "All right," he said, his voice a touch sharper. "Let's take a breath. We still have an hour of this broadcast left. Let's try to keep this about the issues." Karoline leaned back, folding her arms across her chest, her eyes still locked on Michelle. She had landed the first blow, and she knew it. The cameras captured the scene perfectly, the young, fiery conservative and the poised, battle-hardened political icon, both unyielding, both unwilling to back down. And the crowd. They were leaning in, waiting for the next strike, the next verbal blow, the next crack in the carefully constructed images both women had built around themselves. The air in the studio crackled with tension, every eye locked on the stage, every breath held in anticipation. Then Michelle Obama's voice cut through the atmosphere, sharp and biting, shattering the fragile silence. "You're nothing but a political puppet, Karoline, clinging to Trump's coattails like a lifeline. Without him, you're irrelevant." The room froze. The echo of her words seemed to linger in the air, bouncing off the polished studio walls. Even the camera crew exchanged quick, wide-eyed glances. Anderson Cooper, seated in the moderator's chair, blinked momentarily, caught off guard by the sudden escalation. He adjusted his earpiece, the only sound in the stunned silence, before leaning slightly forward, his eyes flicking nervously between the two women. Karoline Leavitt's jaw tightened, a faint, dangerous smile playing at the corner of her lips. She straightened in her chair, her hands tightening around the edges of the polished glass tabletop, as if physically bracing herself for the impact of the next verbal strike. The studio's cool, clinical lighting cast sharp shadows across the room, reflecting off the polished surfaces and capturing every flicker of expression. The set design, deep blues, sleek blacks, and a towering digital backdrop displaying the show's title in bold, unflinching letters, added a layer of drama that only heightened the growing sense of confrontation. Cooper cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the tension. "Welcome back to Fox News. Tonight, where we have with us today two of the most influential voices in modern American politics, former First Lady Michelle Obama and White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt. We're here to discuss the impact of leadership policy and the ongoing challenges facing our nation." Leavitt's eyes never left Michelle's, her gaze unblinking, a silent promise of retaliation hanging in the air. "Michelle, you've been very vocal about your criticisms of the current administration." Cooper continued, trying to steer the conversation back to a semblance of professionalism. "In your recent appearance on The View, you described the Trump administration as divisive and harmful, particularly in the context of immigration and health care. Would you care to elaborate on that?" Michelle shifted slightly, her polished, practiced smile slipping back into place. She crossed her legs, leaned back in her chair, and exhaled slowly, as if resetting her composure. Her voice, when it came, was steady, controlled, the tone of someone who had sparred in the political arena for decades. "I stand by my words," Anderson Michelle began, her tone measured. "The Trump administration's policies have torn this country apart. The rhetoric, the fear-mongering, the divisive tactics, they're designed to pit Americans against each other. And people like Karoline here are the mouthpieces for that chaos." Leavitt's smile sharpened her grip on the table, easing as she prepared to respond. She tilted her head slightly, a calculated gesture that conveyed both confidence and defiance. "With all due respect," Michelle Karoline cut in, her voice crisp and cutting, "you talk about chaos, but let's not pretend that the Obama administration was some era of harmony. Under your husband's watch, economic growth stagnated, middle-class jobs evaporated, and foreign adversaries grew bolder. That's the legacy you left behind." Michelle's eyes narrowed, the controlled mask slipping for a fraction of a second. "At least we didn't lead with fear and division. We believed in unity." Karoline leaned forward, her eyes flashing. "Unity. You mean like the chaos on the southern border, like the racial tensions that exploded across this country under your watch? Don't preach unity when your policies planted the seeds of division." The studio light seemed to burn brighter as the two women locked eyes, neither willing to yield. Cooper shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing the brewing storm, but unable to steer the conversation back onto safer ground. Michelle drew a deep breath, her jaw setting, the polished veneer of her public persona showing cracks. She straightened her shoulders, back eyes locked on Karoline. "You're young, Karoline. Ambitious. But you're also dangerously naive if you think this country can survive on sound bites and bravado. Leadership demands more than just echoing a man's talking points." Leavitt didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of the lips that conveyed a sense of control, of confidence that bordered on defiance. "I'm not just echoing talking points. Michelle," she said, her voice lowering but gaining a dangerous edge, "I'm here to set the record straight. You want to talk about leadership? Let's talk about actions, not just words. Trump's administration rebuilt this economy, created jobs, and put America first. You can try to dismiss that, but the facts don't lie." Michelle opened her mouth to respond, but Karoline wasn't finished. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper, each word slicing through the air like a blade. And for the record, she added, her eyes locking on to Michelle's, I don't cling to anyone's coattails. I make my own path. And unlike you, I don't need a husband's legacy to define me. The studio fell into a deep, echoing silence. Even Cooper seemed to hold his breath, his hands gripping the edge of his notes as if bracing for the impact of the verbal bombs being thrown. Michelle's lips tightened, her hands clenching briefly in her lap before she forced herself to relax her polished, controlled exterior, slipping back into place. But the damage was done. Karoline had landed a direct hit, and everyone in the room knew it. Cooper cleared his throat again, his voice unsteady as he tried to regain control of the show. All right, we'll take a quick break and return with more from our guests. Stay tuned. As the camera's red light blinked off, the silence remained thick and charged like the air before a storm. The camera panned back to Karoline, her jaw set, eyes sharp as steel. She leaned forward, fingertips brushing the table, voice low but electric. You want to talk about fake Michelle? Let's talk about your so-called legacy. Michelle's eyes flashed, the polished calm slipping just a fraction. The studio air grew thick like the moments before a summer storm. Anderson Cooper glanced nervously between them, feeling the tension spike. He cleared his throat, ready to step in, but Karoline's voice sliced through the air, sharp and unwavering. You and your husband promised hope, but left behind division. You call Trump a divider, but it was your administration that sowed chaos, weakened borders, and doubled the national debt. You want to talk about families, your policies forced millions into poverty. So spare me the lecture on compassion. Michelle straightened her jaw, tightening the calm mask, slipping further. Is that so? She replied, her tone icy. And what has your hero done? He built a wall that didn't stop anything but compassion. He bullied allies and coddled tyrants. If that's leadership, then God help this country. The audience held its breath, the hum of the studio lights suddenly deafening. Anderson, ever the professional, leaned in, trying to regain control. All right, let's bring this back to the issues. Michelle, you've spoken about unity and compassion. Karoline, you've raised economic points. Let's stick to that. Karoline didn't miss a beat. Unity, you mean like the riots under your watch? Like the streets burning in 2014? Or the cities that bled while you sat in the White House throwing fancy dinners and writing memoirs? A low rumble rippled through the crowd. Michelle's eyes narrowed, her polished exterior cracking like glass under pressure. She leaned in, her voice dropping an octave. You think you know the first thing about leadership, about the weight of real responsibility? I watched my husband hold this country together while people like you tried to tear it apart with lies and cheap slogans. Karoline leaned back, folding her arms. And yet here we are in a stronger economy, lower unemployment, and a border that isn't just a line in the sand. You call that chaos, I call it progress. Anderson's cue card trembled slightly in his hand. He cleared his throat, voice tight. All right, let's move on to the next topic. But Karoline pushed forward, voice rising. No, let's not move on. Let's talk about the jobs that came back, the factories that reopened, the communities that found their voice again after years of being told they didn't matter. Michelle's lips pressed into a thin line. And at what cost? Alienated allies, shattered diplomacy, families broken apart at the border. You can wave your flag all you want, but don't pretend it hasn't come at a price. Karoline's eyes flared, a hint of a smile curling at the edges. At least we're waving the flag, Michelle. At least we still believe in America first, instead of apologizing for it. The studio fell silent. Even Anderson hesitated, his polished TV smile slipping just for a heartbeat. He felt the shift in the room, the energy crackling like live wires. This was no longer an interview. It was a battleground. Michelle exhaled sharply, leaning back in her chair, eyes locking with Karoline's. The gloves were off. She could feel it. And from the fire in Karoline's eyes, she knew this battle was just heating up. The tension in the studio had transformed into something sharper, more dangerous. Anderson Cooper, usually the master of keeping a panel in line, felt control slipping through his fingers like sand. He shuffled his notes, eyes darting between Michelle and Karoline, but the two women were locked in a verbal duel, neither willing to break eye contact. Michelle leaned forward, her fingers pressed together like a steeple. You call yourselves patriots, but what you really are is a cult, she said, voice like cold steel. The audience collectively inhaled. It was the kind of line that could turn a heated debate into an all-out brawl. Blind loyalty to a man who's broken every rule of decency, every standard of respect. You call that leadership? Karoline's eyes narrowed, a flicker of a smile curving her lips. She leaned in elbows on the table, eyes gleaming. You want to talk about respect? Let's talk about using the IRS to target political enemies. Let's talk about spying on journalists about a healthcare system that collapsed under its own promises. Don't preach to me about decency. Michelle's jaw tightened, her polished calm giving way to a flash of genuine anger. She straightened chin, lifting eyes fierce. At least we tried to lift people up. At least we didn't spend our time tearing down every institution, every ally, every principle this country stands for. Lift people up? Karoline's laugh was sharp-cutting. You left the middle class in shambles, pushed jobs overseas, and doubled the national debt. You threw stones from your ivory tower, and now you want to lecture us about principles. The crowd stirred murmurs rippling through the studio. Anderson tried to regain control, his professional mask slipping into genuine concern. All right, let's bring this back. But Michelle wasn't done. She leaned closer, her eyes locked on Karoline's, her voice a slow, measured blade. You wrap yourself in the flag, Karoline, but it's just a shield. A way to cover the fact that your party's policies favor the wealthy, the powerful, the ones who already have more than enough. You pretend to speak for the forgotten, but it's all a con. Karoline's eyes flashed, her jaw clenching. And you pretend to be the voice of the people, but you've spent more time on private jets and luxury book tours than in the neighborhoods you claim to represent. Spare me the sanctimony. The tension was now a tangible thing, a coiled spring ready to snap. Anderson leaned forward, his voice urgent. Ladies, please, we're here to discuss the issues. But the two women ignored him, their focused, locked voices sharp enough to cut glass. You think I don't care about this country? Michelle shot back, her voice rising, eyes blazing. I spent 8 years in a pressure cooker trying to make real change while facing the kind of hate and lies you can't even imagine. Oh, I can imagine, Karoline fired back, because I live it every day. Every time I walk into a studio like this, I know half the people here want to see me fail. But that's the difference, Michelle. I thrive on it. A sharp silence fell over the studio. Even the cameraman had stopped moving, their lenses fixed on the two women. Anderson, his cue cards forgotten, glanced nervously at his producer, who was frantically gesturing for a commercial break. But Michelle leaned back, folding her hands together, her expression shifting from anger to something colder, more calculating. She took a breath, her gaze never leaving Karoline's. You want to play this game fine, but remember, the higher you climb, the further you have to fall. Karoline's lips parted, a hint of a retort forming, but the studio lights suddenly dimmed, the commercial break music swelling over the speakers. Anderson exhaled in relief, his shoulders dropping, his microphone still live as he muttered, "We'll be right back." As the cameras cut to commercial, the studio erupted into a controlled chaos. Producers swarmed the stage crew members, whispered into headsets, and makeup artists darted forward to blot the sweat from both women's foreheads. But even as the chaos swirled around them, Michelle and Karoline remained locked in their silent standoff, eyes blazing, hearts racing, neither willing to back down. The real battle was just beginning. As the studio lights flickered back on, the tension in the room had crystallized into something electric, almost combustible. Anderson Cooper, leaning forward, his hands clasped tightly together, knew he had lost control of the interview. But that didn't seem to matter anymore. This wasn't just television now. It was a battleground. Michelle Obama leaned back in her chair, a small, tight smile on her lips, her eyes locked on Karoline Leavitt like a hawk circling prey. She had decided to go for the jugular. You know what the difference is between us? Karoline Michelle's voice cut through the low hum of cameras and whispered instructions from the control room. I built my legacy on actual service. You built yours on outrage, on noise. You're a glorified provocateur, not a leader. The audience, a mix of curiosity and simmering tension, held its collective breath. Karoline's eyes narrowed, her hands resting on the table, fingers splayed as if ready to push back. Outrage, Karoline's voice was steady but edged with steel. Outrage is watching my generation get buried under debt, watching American cities crumble, while politicians like you lecture us about dignity and unity from your gated communities. That's real outrage. Michelle's smile tightened, the lines around her eyes hardening. You think you have the monopoly on frustration? Please, I've spent decades being told to smile, to soften my words, to play nice, while the media picked apart every aspect of my life. And yet, Karoline shot back, leaning in her eyes bright with defiance. You've never hesitated to tear down those who disagree with you. You preach about unity while calling half the country irredeemable. Anderson cleared his throat, his eyes darting between the two women. He could feel the control slipping further, the conversation veering into dangerous personal territory. But the two women seemed oblivious, locked in a duel neither was willing to end. You want to talk about unity. Michelle's voice was sharper now, the polished veneer giving way to something raw and unfiltered. I've seen unity, I've lived it. But what you and your kind are selling is division. It's fear dressed up as patriotism. Karoline's fingers curled into fists. Patriotism. You talk about patriotism like it's a fashion choice, like you can put it on when it suits your narrative and toss it aside when it doesn't. But real patriotism is about more than just words. It's about sacrifice. It's about standing up for the people who don't have a voice. Michelle's eyes narrowed, her tone dropping to a near whisper, the kind that carries more weight than a shout. Don't lecture me about sacrifice. You don't know the meaning of the word. The studio fell into a heavy silence, the kind that pulls all the air from the room. Anderson leaned back, his fingers tapping nervously against his cue cards. This was no longer an interview. It was a confrontation. Oh, I know sacrifice, Karoline said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. I know what it's like to be ridiculed, to be dismissed, to be labeled as a problem simply for standing up for what I believe in. Don't pretend your struggles are unique. Michelle's eyes flashed, her jaw tightening, but she said nothing. The control room's red light blinks, signaling that they were about to cut to another break, but neither woman moved. They were frozen in their silent clash, their words hanging in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Finally, Anderson leaned in, his voice low and strained, almost pleading. We'll be right back. The camera lights dimmed the studio, falling into a momentary shadow. But even as the makeup artists rushed forward and the producers whispered furiously into their headsets, the real fire on that stage remained unextinguished. It had only just begun. As the stage lights came back up, the studio felt more like a coliseum than a newsroom. The air was thick with the crackling tension of unspoken challenges, the kind that makes every breath feel like a dare. Michelle Obama and Karoline Leavitt sat across from each other, their eyes locked in a silent battle jaws, set each refusing to blink first. Anderson Cooper, caught between the two political titans, cleared his throat, his hand tightening around his cue cards. He glanced at the camera, the red light steady like the eye of a storm. He was supposed to moderate this, but the gloves had come off hours ago, and now he was merely a spectator to a collision of forces beyond his control. You know, Karoline, Michelle said, leaning back in her chair, her tone smooth but her eyes sharp. The problem with you and your generation is that you mistake noise for strength. You mistake social media likes for real influence. Karoline's lips curled into a small, unamused smile. And you mistake institutional power for moral authority, she shot back. You built a brand on being above the fray, on unity and dignity, but you've spent the last decade dividing people. Michelle's eyes narrowed, her polished calm cracking for a split second. She leaned forward, hands clasped, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper. Don't talk to me about division. I've watched this country splinter under the weight of cheap populism and reckless rhetoric. Karoline leaned in, matching Michelle's intensity. Reckless? You want to talk about recklessness. How about an administration that doubled the national debt and left American cities crumbling under crime and economic decay? You talk about unity, but you governed through division. You just hid it better. The studio audience was still, the air thickening with the kind of anticipation that comes before a thunderclap. Anderson glanced nervously at the control room where a producer frantically motioned for him to cut to a commercial. But he didn't. He couldn't. The momentum was too raw, too real. You think you're brave, Michelle continued, her voice rising. You stand on a stage and shout about patriotism, but you've never had to actually govern. You've never had to make a decision that impacts millions. It's easy to criticize from the sidelines. Karoline's eyes flashed. I'm not on the sidelines. I'm in the fight every single day, standing up for the people who can't afford to live in gated communities or send their kids to private schools. You talk about sacrifice, but you've been protected by a system that never held you accountable. Michelle leaned back, a bitter smile on her lips. And you're just another loud voice in a long line of political opportunists exploiting fear for fame. Karoline's response was immediate, her voice slicing through the thick air. And you're a relic of a bygone era, clinging to relevance in a world that's moved on. The crowd gasped softly, the sharp intake of breath like a collective wince. Anderson leaned in, finally finding his voice. Ladies, we need to... But Michelle cut him off, her eyes never leaving Karoline's. I'm not finished. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. You think you're the future, you're just a moment. A fleeting headline. And when the cameras turn off and the tweets stop, you'll be forgotten. Karoline's face hardened, her eyes locking onto Michelle's. Then let's make this moment count. She leaned in until their faces were mere inches apart, the studio lights catching the fire in her eyes. Because history remembers those who stand their ground, not those who play it safe. Anderson, sensing the precarious edge they had reached, cut in quickly. We'll be right back. The red light blinked off the studio, falling into an uneasy silence. As the camera operators stepped back and the stage crew moved in to touch up makeup and adjust microphones, Michelle and Karoline remained locked in their silent war eyes, still locked, neither willing to be the first to look away. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot.